The door at the far end of the third-floor corridor remained open by only a few inches, yet the darkness beyond it possessed a depth that seemed impossible. The warm amber lamps mounted along the walls cast more than enough light to illuminate the richly patterned carpet beneath their feet, the polished oak doors lining either side of the corridor, and the gleaming brass room numbers fixed neatly beside each frame. But none of that light reached whatever lay beyond the narrow opening. Instead, it simply disappeared, swallowed by a darkness that appeared to exist independently of the room itself, giving Ethan the unsettling impression that the doorway did not lead into another part of the hotel at all, but into somewhere entirely outside the ordinary world. For several long seconds, nobody dared move. Every member of the group remained exactly where they had stopped, their breathing the only sound breaking the suffocating silence that had settled over the corridor. Even the old hotel, which until now had seemed to groan and creak constantly around them, had fallen unnaturally still. There was no distant rumble of plumbing hidden behind the walls, no whisper of rain against the windows, no hum from electrical wiring concealed in the ceiling. It was as though the entire building had paused, patiently waiting to see what they would do next. Ethan found himself staring at the impossible doorway, while every instinct he possessed urged him to turn around immediately. Throughout his career as an architect, he had learned to trust those instincts. They had warned him when a structure was unsafe long before the calculations proved it. They had allowed him to spot flaws other professionals overlooked, and more than once they had prevented serious accidents before construction had even begun. Those same instincts were now telling him something he struggled to accept. This corridor was fundamentally wrong. Not damaged, not poorly designed, wrong. The proportions refused to obey the rules that governed every building ever constructed. And the longer he looked, the more certain he became that he was standing inside a place that should not have been capable of existing. Behind him, the others remained equally captivated by the sight before them, although each seemed to be processing it in their own way. Liam had finally fallen silent after spending much of the night trying to bury his fear beneath nervous humor. Sophie continued searching every inch of the corridor with the determined expression of someone refusing to surrender logic, almost as though she believed that if she observed enough details, she would eventually uncover a perfectly ordinary explanation for everything that had happened. Daniel had unconsciously positioned himself slightly in front of Chloe, placing himself between her and the darkness, despite knowing full well that such a gesture would offer little protection if whatever haunted Alder House truly decided to reveal itself. Margaret, meanwhile, appeared almost transfixed, her eyes never leaving the half-open doorway, and Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't simply looking at it, she was remembering it. Only one person seemed even more unsettled than the guests, the receptionist. His pale face had lost what little color it possessed, while the calm, measured composure he had maintained throughout the night had finally begun to fracture. His eyes remained fixed on the opening in the distance, yet there was no curiosity in his expression, only recognition. Not the recognition of someone seeing something familiar, but of someone witnessing an event they had spent years desperately hoping would never happen. "You've never seen it open before, have you?" Ethan asked quietly. The receptionist answered without taking his eyes off the doorway. "No." The single word hung heavily between them. "I've always known it existed." Another pause followed before he continued, his voice noticeably quieter than before. "But until tonight, it never invited anyone while I was still here to see it." Ethan frowned. "You mean this has happened before?" "I know it has." "How?" The receptionist finally turned towards him, and for the first time since Ethan had arrived at Alder House Hotel, there was no mystery behind his expression. There was only exhaustion. "Because people disappeared." No one replied. "I've watched guests arrive." His eyes drifted slowly along the corridor. "I've watched families report them missing." He swallowed. "And I've watched police officers search every room in this building without ever finding a single trace of them." Margaret's breathing caught. "My brother." The receptionist looked at her with genuine sadness. "I believe Thomas found the same door." The words landed with far greater weight than anyone expected. Margaret lowered her head, pressing trembling fingers against her mouth as years of buried grief resurfaced all at once. Sophie instinctively rested a comforting hand upon her shoulder, though she knew there was little she could say that would ease pain carried for more than 3 decades. "I'm sorry," Sophie whispered. Margaret gave the faintest shake of her head. "I stopped expecting answers years ago." She looked back toward the darkness. But somehow, a tear rolled gently down her cheek. "I don't think I ever stopped hoping." The silence that followed felt almost sacred. Eventually, Ethan forced himself to take a cautious step forwards, then another. Without needing to discuss it, the others naturally followed, staying close together as though the simple act of remaining within arm's reach somehow offered protection against whatever awaited them further along the corridor. Their footsteps landed softly upon the thick carpet, muffled almost completely, until it became difficult to tell whether they were hearing one another walking or imagining the sound entirely. As they continued forwards, Ethan's attention shifted away from the open doorway and towards the corridor itself. The architect within him refused to remain quiet. Every detail seemed to demand examination. Every measurement contradicted the one before it. He counted the doors again. Room 301, room 303, room 305, then room 309. He stopped walking. The others immediately noticed. "What is it?" Daniel asked. Ethan slowly turned back towards the row of doors they had already passed. "It still isn't there." "What isn't?" Liam asked. 307. Liam blinked. So there should be another doorway." He pointed calmly along the wall. "The spacing between every room is almost identical. If there's no room 307, then these rooms should all be wider." Nobody said anything. "They aren't." He continued studying the corridor. "The walls haven't moved. The ceiling hasn't changed. The windows are evenly spaced." His voice became quieter as the realization settled inside him. "The space for room 307 still exists?" Sophie frowned. "So where is it?" Ethan looked back toward the half-open door waiting in the distance. "I think that's exactly what we're about to find out." Before anyone could answer, Liam suddenly reached out and touched Ethan's arm. "Mate." His voice was barely audible. "The windows." Ethan followed Liam's gaze. Every window running along the left-hand side of the corridor should have overlooked the lock below. Instead, they reflected the corridor itself. Not like ordinary mirrors. There were no reflections of the group standing before them. No reflections of the lights. No reflections at all. Beyond the glass stretched another corridor, identical in every detail, disappearing endlessly into the distance until it faded into darkness. Daniel stepped closer to one of the windows. He hesitated. "That's impossible." Sophie carefully rested 2 fingers against the cold glass. "It isn't a screen." "No. It isn't a mirror either." She looked back at Ethan. "I genuinely have no explanation." Liam gave a humorless laugh. "I think we've officially passed the point where that's becoming your catchphrase." Despite everything, Sophie smiled. Only briefly. It disappeared almost immediately as something else caught Ethan's attention. The paintings. He could have sworn they had changed. Earlier that evening, every frame picture decorating the corridor had depicted peaceful landscapes surrounding Alder House Hotel. Rolling hills bathed in morning sunlight, still waters stretching across the loch, and forests wrapped in gentle mist had given the hallway a strangely comforting atmosphere. Those paintings were gone. Every frame now showed only one subject, the hotel itself. Each painting captured Alder House during a different decade. One showed elegant horse-drawn carriages waiting outside the entrance beneath gas lamps. Another depicted guests arriving in polished motor cars from the 1920s. Further along, fashions changed, vehicles modernized, and the decades quietly slipped by. Yet the building itself appeared almost untouched by time. Then Ethan noticed something deeply unsettling. Someone appeared in every painting. Not the same figure, the same woman, Margaret, older in some, younger in others, sometimes standing beside the entrance, sometimes looking up at the windows, sometimes simply watching the hotel from across the road. Always alone, always waiting. Margaret slowly approached the nearest painting until she stood only inches away from the glass. I... Her voice trembled. I've never seen these. She reached out carefully. I don't remember standing there. The receptionist closed his eyes. It remembers. Margaret looked towards him. What does? The hotel. He opened his eyes again. It remembers everyone who comes back. Ethan stared at the paintings once more. Not once had Margaret been smiling. Not once had she looked happy. She had always been searching. And somehow, the hotel had remembered. Every visit. For several long moments, nobody spoke. The paintings had transformed what had once seemed like an unexplained disappearance into something far more disturbing. They were no longer simply searching for the truth about room 307. The hotel itself appeared to be collecting memories, preserving every person who returned to search for someone they had lost, as though Alder House possessed an awareness extending far beyond its walls. Ethan found himself studying Margaret's face rather than the paintings themselves, noticing the mixture of grief and quiet determination behind her tired eyes. She was no longer simply remembering her brother. She was remembering every year she had refused to let him go. I came back, she said softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. Not every year, but enough. Sometimes I would book a room. Sometimes I'd just stand outside the entrance for an hour before getting back on the train. I never told anybody because I knew how ridiculous it sounded. Every time I convinced myself I was wasting my life chasing something impossible, but every time I reached the station, something inside me told me to come back one more time. Nobody judged her. If anything, every person standing in that corridor understood her better than they would have only a few hours earlier. You thought he was still here, Sophie said gently. Margaret nodded without taking her eyes from the paintings. I don't know why, I just felt it. Even after 32 years, I never believed he was dead. The receptionist quietly folded his hands in front of him before speaking again, choosing his words with the same careful precision he had used throughout the night. The people who returned always said the same thing. Everyone turned towards him. They never came back because they believed. He paused for a moment, almost searching for the correct wording. They came back because the hotel wouldn't allow them to stop wondering. The sentence settled heavily over the group. Ethan wasn't sure whether the receptionist was describing grief or something far more sinister. His attention drifted once again towards the windows lining the left-hand wall, and the strange unease that had been growing inside him since stepping onto the third floor returned almost immediately. The reflections beyond the glass still refused to behave naturally. Instead of showing the lock outside, they revealed another corridor stretching into the distance, perfectly matching the one in which they stood. Yet the longer Ethan stared, the more convinced he became that the two corridors were not identical after all. Something's different. Sophie stepped beside him. What have you noticed? The lights. She looked carefully through the glass. For several seconds she saw nothing unusual. Then her expression changed. The lamps? They're brighter, Ethan finished. Not dramatically. Just enough that the corridor beyond appeared newer, cleaner, and somehow untouched by time. The wallpaper carried richer colors. The carpet looked as though nobody had ever walked across it, and the polished wood surrounding every doorway gleamed with the deep shine of fresh varnish. It isn't showing us another corridor, Ethan murmured. I think it's showing us another version of this one. Margaret slowly approached the window, resting trembling fingertips against the cold glass. It looked like this. Her voice sounded distant. When Thomas disappeared, everyone turned towards her. The flowers downstairs were fresh. The carpets looked new. The wallpaper wasn't faded. She closed her eyes. For years I thought my memory had changed the place because I'd become older. She looked back through the impossible window. It wasn't my memory that changed. The hotel did. A chill passed through every member of the group. The receptionist lowered his head. Eleanor Alder believed buildings could remember every life lived inside them. Liam frowned. Who exactly was Eleanor? For the first time that night, the receptionist didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked towards the darkness at the end of the corridor as though expecting someone else to object. When Alder House was built, he finally began, Eleanor lived here with her husband and her only son. They were respected throughout the county, wealthy, educated, generous. The hotel quickly became famous, and guests traveled from every corner of Britain to stay here. "What happened?" Daniel asked quietly. The receptionist's tired eyes met his. Her son disappeared. Nobody interrupted. There was no sign of a struggle, no witnesses, no body. He simply vanished from his room during the night. Margaret's breathing caught. The room, the receptionist nodded slowly. It was numbered 307. Silence followed. Eleanor refused to accept that her son was gone. She searched every room, every cellar, every stretch of woodland surrounding the hotel. Weeks became months. Months became years. Some people said grief drove her mad. "And you don't believe that?" Sophie asked. "No." The receptionist's voice became quieter than ever. "I think she found something." Nobody noticed the corridor growing darker around them until Liam instinctively looked over his shoulder. "Does anyone else think the lights are fading?" Ethan turned. The warm amber glow that had illuminated the hallway since they arrived was becoming steadily weaker. Not flickering, simply dimming, as though someone somewhere inside the hotel had begun lowering the power one bulb at a time. The shadows stretched longer across the carpet. The paintings became harder to distinguish. Even the open doorway at the far end seemed to deepen until it was almost impossible to separate darkness from the room beyond. Then, without warning, a loud metallic click echoed somewhere behind them. Every head turned at once. The heavy staircase door they had used only minutes earlier had slowly drifted open by itself. For the first time since reaching the third floor, they could see beyond it. Daniel released a relieved breath. The stairs. Real stairs. Real handrails. Real walls. Nothing impossible. Nothing supernatural. Just the staircase leading back toward the lobby. "I think we've got our chance," he said, taking an eager step towards the doorway. Nobody moved with him. The receptionist's face had turned completely pale. "No." His voice barely escaped his lips. "It isn't offering you a way out." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" The receptionist never answered, because as Daniel reached the threshold and looked through the open doorway, every trace of relief vanished from his face. He stopped so suddenly that Chloe almost walked into him. "Daniel?" He didn't speak. His eyes remained fixed on whatever lay beyond. Very slowly, Chloe stepped beside him. A second later, she covered her mouth. Ethan's heart began hammering as he walked cautiously towards them. The staircase had disappeared. Beyond the doorway stretched another corridor, another third floor, another Alder House Hotel, and this one contained every room, including room 307. At the very end of the impossibly long hallway, beneath a single softly glowing lamp, someone stood waiting outside the door, perfectly motionless, as though they had known all along that Ethan would eventually look back.